They kept the body locked in a wooden crate, nailed shut, and buried beneath the stone floor of a church no one attends anymore. The priest who performed the burial refused payment. His only request was that no one ever speak the boy's name again. In the autumn of 1883, deep in the shadowed hills of Virginia, there lived a child whose veins ran with something no doctor dared write down. When they cut him open, gold, not blood, spilled from his wounds. It wasn't molten. It wasn't soft. It clinked against the surgeon's tray like coins dropped by an invisible hand. The midwife fainted at the sight. The father locked himself in the barn and never came out alive. And the boy, barely 10 years old, lived for another 7 months. 7 months of fear, isolation, and whispered prayers, until the townspeople finally decided he was never meant to walk among them. You are not supposed to know this. Stories like his are buried beneath dusty courthouse archives, censored medical reports, and church confessions sealed in red wax. Because once you see the truth behind this boy's life, you will begin to question everything you've been taught about history, medicine, and the very limits of human nature. This is not just a tale of superstition or small-town panic. It is the record of something ancient moving beneath the surface of society, something powerful enough to rewrite the laws of life and death. The boy was not an accident. He was a message. Tonight I'm going to take you back to that fog-choked town in 1883, and I'm going to walk you through the events leading up to his burial. But understand this, once you step inside this story, there is no going back. The walls of reality will feel thinner when you're done, and you will carry the weight of what you've learned like a curse. So take a deep breath and listen closely. In the hollow silence of rural Virginia, a boy was born who would bleed gold instead of blood. And his story is not a legend, it's a warning. The first sign came the night he was born. The midwife, a stern woman who had delivered half the town's children, claimed she felt the boy's heartbeat through her fingertips. But it wasn't a beat. It was a hum, faint and metallic, like the ringing of a tuning fork. She told no one, not at first. The birth was long, brutal, and soaked in a silence that made the old farmhouse feel like a coffin. His mother screamed until her voice shattered, and when the child finally slipped into the world, he didn't cry. He only opened his eyes so pale they looked colorless, and stared at her like a stranger. It wasn't until she cut the cord that the room froze. The blood wasn't red. It wasn't even liquid. It glimmered under the lantern light like powdered gold, clinging to the knife and dripping into a porcelain bowl with a soft metallic chime. The midwife crossed herself, whispering a prayer under her breath, and for a moment she thought of killing him right then, before the father returned from the fields. But she didn't. Instead, she wrapped him tightly in a linen cloth and told his mother to sleep. She burned the blood-soaked rags before dawn. For weeks they tried to keep the boy a secret. They named him Isaac, but they never said his name aloud. He grew quickly, too quickly. His skin stayed pale, almost translucent, and no matter how much he ate, his veins shimmered faintly beneath his skin, like thin threads of sunlight. When he cried, it wasn't the wail of a baby. It was sharper, almost metallic, like glass vibrating. People in town began whispering about the farm. Animals refused to go near the house, and then came the fever. At just 3 months old, Isaac began burning from the inside out. His temperature climbed higher than any doctor could measure. When they lanced a boil on his arm to relieve the swelling, the liquid that poured out wasn't pus. It was molten yellow, flecked with something that looked like ground-up gold dust. The doctor refused payment and left town before sunrise. That was when the family knew. Their son wasn't sick. He was something else. And whatever he was, he had been sent here for a reason. By the time Isaac turned 5, his name was already a curse in the valley. The farmhouse sat on a hill overlooking the town, and people swore they could see a faint glow in the windows at night, a dull yellow flicker that pulsed like a heartbeat. Children were forbidden to play near the property. Grown men who walked past claimed their lanterns dimmed when they crossed the gate, and the animals. They refused to enter the barn, no matter how hard they were beaten or bribed with feed. Inside the house, the family had become prisoners. Isaac's mother, once a lively woman with dark hair and a soft laugh, had withered to a silent shadow. She stopped attending church after the priest asked if she'd ever seen her son cast one. The father worked his fields in silence, hands trembling on the plough. They had no more visitors, no more neighbors dropping in with bread or gossip, just whispers in the marketplace and stares at Sunday sermons. It wasn't just fear of the unknown, it was disgust. They said Isaac's eyes reflected light even in total darkness, that his skin carried a faint sheen, as if dusted with fine metal powder, that when he bled, which was often, small cuts from play, a scraped knee, a nosebleed, he left trails of golden flecks behind him, glinting like coins spilled on dirt. The more he grew, the less he seemed like a child. At school it was worse. The teacher refused to let him write with ink because the quill bent under his grip. The other children mocked him, called him devil's gold, and wouldn't sit near him. One boy threw a rock at him once. Isaac didn't cry. He only touched the wound, and golden droplets slid down his cheek. The other children screamed and fled, and the teacher fainted when she tried to clean the blood and found it hardened like flakes of real metal on her fingers. After that, Isaac never went back. His father locked the gate. His mother boarded the windows. They prayed over him nightly, whispering psalms through cracked lips, but every prayer only seemed to make him worse. The fever came back in waves, and with it, something else, something darker. Isaac had started to dream, and when he woke, he spoke of things no child should know. Isaac's dreams began the winter he turned 6. They started as murmurs, half-formed words whispered in his sleep, a strange language that no one in the house recognized. His mother thought he was repeating words from church, until one night she leaned close and realized he was speaking backward. The sound of it made her teeth ache. She slapped him awake, trembling, and begged him never to speak like that again. Isaac didn't respond. He just stared at her with those pale, unblinking eyes. Soon, the dreams grew stronger. He'd wake in the dead of night, drenched in sweat, his fever so high the lantern glass fogged when his father brought it near, and every time there'd be something strange, a symbol scratched into the wallboards with perfect precision, or piles of golden flakes on the sheets, arranged in spirals too deliberate to be random. Once his mother found him standing barefoot in the snow outside the house, staring at the horizon. He wasn't shivering, his lips moved, whispering in that same backward tongue. By spring, the boy had stopped sleeping in his bed entirely. He insisted on lying on the floor, saying the earth beneath the house spoke to him. The family priest, a nervous young man sent by the diocese, tried to bless the boy, but when he entered Isaac's room, his crucifix cracked in two, not broke, cracked cleanly, as if split by an invisible hand. The priest left before sundown and never returned. And then came the drawings. Isaac began carving shapes into the wooden walls with his fingernails, deep grooves that bled gold dust when he dragged his hands away. They weren't childish scribbles. They were symbols, perfect circles, interlocking triangles, and patterns his parents had never seen before. A traveling scholar from Richmond was summoned to examine them, and when he entered the boy's room, he froze. He claimed the symbols were older than Christianity, older than Rome, older even than Babylon. He left without explanation, his face pale as ash, and told the family they should burn the house before something followed him out. But they didn't. The father refused. He believed Isaac was a gift from God, a test of faith. The mother wasn't so sure anymore. Every night she heard him whispering to the floor, and every morning the gold dust patterns grew more complex. It was as if something beneath the earth was teaching him. By the summer of 1883, Isaac's name wasn't spoken openly anymore. People referred to him only as that boy, or the one on the hill, their voices low, as though even mentioning him might draw something down upon them. Travelers passing through the valley heard the whispers first. A merchant from Philadelphia claimed he saw a golden-haired ghost watching him from a fence post at midnight, though Isaac's hair was dark. A Union veteran swore he heard the sound of coins spilling behind him as he rode past the farm, only to turn and find nothing there but a boy standing barefoot in the road, staring at him with eyes like pale glass. These stories spread quickly, faster than the family could silence them. By August, the farmhouse had become a kind of omen. If you saw a lantern in its windows late at night, something bad would happen before dawn. Livestock would be found dead, tools would shatter, infants would cry endlessly until morning. Rational men laughed at these rumors, until the sheriff himself stopped riding near the property. He'd once been called there after a report of screaming. He found Isaac alone in the barn, crouched in the straw, whispering to himself in that backward tongue. When he tried to pull the boy up by his arm, Isaac turned and touched his hand. The sheriff's palm blistered instantly, the skin rising in bright golden welts that hardened like metal. He fled the farm that night and handed in his badge by week's end. The boy wasn't just strange, he was dangerous, and yet something about him drew people in. Some began sneaking up the hill, leaving offerings at the gate, coins, herbs, candles, half out of fear, half out of some unspoken belief that Isaac wasn't a curse at all, but a key to something far older than their little town. It was around this time that strangers began arriving, well-dressed men from cities like Richmond, Baltimore, even Washington. They came with notebooks, locked chests, and questions they never asked out loud. Some carried crucifixes, others carried rifles. None stayed long. They'd spend a single night in the farmhouse, watching Isaac feverishly draw his impossible symbols on the floorboards, and they'd leave before breakfast, faces ashen. And every time one left, Isaac's father would look a little more hollow, as if he understood something terrible. His son wasn't going to be left alone. The world outside had already smelled blood, or gold. The first carriage rolled in just after harvest season, carrying men who didn't belong to the town. They were not merchants, not preachers, not curious travelers. They were something else entirely. Their coats were too fine, their boots too polished, their eyes too cold. They spoke little, but when they did, their accents were clipped and sharp, like men who had seen the world and left no trace of themselves in it. They introduced themselves to Isaac's father as representatives of medical interests. No one asked from where, no one dared. They carried crates of equipment into the farmhouse, strange metal instruments that caught the lamplight, tools the family had never seen, a hand-cranked centrifuge, small glass vials, surgical knives so sharp they sang when removed from their cases. They didn't knock on doors, they simply entered as if they already owned the place. The leader of the group, a man in a grey wool coat with a silver watch chain, spoke only once to Isaac. He knelt in front of the boy, took his small hand, and studied the faint gold shimmer beneath his translucent skin. Then he smiled, not kindly, but with the satisfaction of a man who'd found what he'd been searching for. That night they began their examinations. Isaac was laid out on the kitchen table, his mother weeping silently in the corner, while his father stood rigid, fists clenched. They pricked his veins and filled vial after vial with the strange golden fluid that pulsed beneath his skin. When the first vial cooled, the substance hardened, not like blood clotting, but like molten metal cooling in a mold. They tapped it with their instruments and listened as it rang like a bell. The men didn't ask questions of the family, they simply took notes, spoke to each other in low, coded voices, and worked until dawn. By morning, Isaac was pale and trembling, but alive. His veins strangely seemed Briggs, greater than ever. The man with the silver watch chain left a satchel of coins on the table, more money than the family had ever seen, and told them they'd return soon. But they didn't leave town immediately. For 3 days the carriage lingered at the inn, its curtains drawn. Locals swore they saw men sneaking out at night, knocking on doors, asking about other anomalies in the valley. No one answered. By the time they finally rode away, the town felt colder, as if their presence had seeped into the soil. And Isaac. Isaac had begun to change. The fever that had plagued him for years broke overnight. He stopped shivering, stopped sweating. He became unnervingly still, as if his body had decided to stop being human. After the men left, the house grew unnaturally quiet. Isaac no longer moaned in his sleep or burned with fever. He no longer cried or flinched when touched. He simply watched. His eyes, once pale and unfocused, now gleamed with an unsettling clarity, like glass polished from the inside. He sat for hours without moving, tracing invisible shapes in the air with his finger, his lips forming silent words. His mother begged his father to send for a priest again, but his father refused. "He's not possessed," he whispered one night. "He's becoming something else." Within weeks, the boy's transformation became undeniable. His body grew leaner, stronger, as though something inside him was rebuilding him from the bones out. The golden sheen beneath his skin spread like veins of ore through marble, faint but visible under candlelight. Even his breath smelled faintly metallic, like copper coins left in rain. But the strangest change wasn't physical, it was in his voice. Isaac rarely spoke, but when he did, his words were measured, deliberate, as if chosen with unnatural care. He started asking questions no 6-year-old should even think to ask. Why do men kneel before other men? Who built the church before there were churches? What was taken from the earth to make men so weak? His father slapped him once for speaking blasphemy, but Isaac didn't cry. He only stared at him and whispered, "I remember." At night, the symbols he scratched into the floorboards became more complex. They were no longer random patterns or childish spirals. They resembled maps, blueprints, constellations. His mother covered them with rugs, but by morning they'd be carved again, larger, deeper. One night his father tried to lock him in his room, but Isaac simply appeared in the kitchen at dawn, barefoot, golden dust trailing behind him like breadcrumbs. By autumn, he stopped sleeping altogether. He'd sit upright in the dark, perfectly still, as if listening to a voice no one else could hear. Once his mother found him kneeling in the barn, his small hands pressed against the dirt floor. She swore she felt something hum beneath her feet, a low vibration like distant thunder. Isaac wasn't dying. He wasn't even sick. Something had been awakened in him, and it was growing stronger every day. Whatever flowed in his veins wasn't just gold, it was memory, ancient memory, older than the valley, older than the town, older than anything human hands had ever built. It started small. Lamps flickered when Isaac entered a room. The air grew heavy around him, thick enough to make his mother dizzy. The family's dog, once loyal and protective, now hid under the porch, snarling whenever Isaac walked by. But soon, the strange disturbances began spreading beyond the farmhouse. A neighbor half a mile down the road swore she saw golden dust drifting in the wind one night, like pollen, but glimmering, catching the moonlight in soft clouds. Her chickens stopped laying eggs the next day, and within a week, all her livestock were dead. Another man claimed he heard the sound of bells ringing underground as he plowed his fields. When he struck the soil with his spade, he found veins of bright metallic gold where there should have been rock. But the gold wasn't solid. It was warm. It pulsed faintly, like it was alive. He never spoke of it again. In the churchyard, Father Donnelly, the only priest left who dared to minister to the valley, noticed that the wooden cross above the altar had begun to split. It wasn't rot. The wood peeled cleanly, as if pushed apart from within, golden streaks running through the grain like veins. He said nothing, but he started locking the church doors at night. Meanwhile, Isaac no longer spoke much to his parents. Instead, he wandered the property barefoot, tracing his fingers along the fences, the barn walls, the soil itself. Wherever he walked, grass stopped growing. The ground seemed to harden, taking on a dull, metallic sheen. The neighbors whispered that he wasn't a boy at all anymore, but a vessel, something ancient and unnatural wearing a child's body like a disguise. And yet, some were drawn to him. A farmer's wife confessed she'd seen him standing by her gate at dawn, his pale eyes fixed on her. Instead of fear, she felt reverence. She knelt before him without understanding why. When she rose, there was dust on her palms, and she swore she heard a voice in her head, not Isaac's, but something vast and resonant, promising her that the earth remembers. Rumors of miracles began spreading alongside the fear. People whispered that Isaac's presence could bless a field or curse it, heal a wound or stop a heart. The townsfolk no longer knew whether to burn the boy or worship him, but one thing was certain: the valley no longer belonged to them. It was his, and whatever moved through his veins had begun claiming the land as its own. The first death came on a night thick with fog, the kind of darkness that swallows lantern light whole. Samuel Whitlock, the blacksmith, was the first to die. He was a brute of a man, the kind who feared neither God nor man, and he'd made it clear he thought Isaac was nothing more than a demon brat. He'd been drinking heavily at the tavern that night, slamming his fists on the table, telling anyone who would listen that someone needed to deal with the thing in that farmhouse. By midnight, he was gone. They found his body at the edge of the farm the next morning. His boots were sunk deep in the mud, as if he'd been rooted there, and his face was frozen in a look of pure terror, eyes wide and glassy. His skin, it wasn't burned, not in the way fire leaves marks. It was as if every drop of moisture had been drawn out of him. He was brittle, his flesh pale and cracking like dried clay. His veins, what was left of them, were laced with fine threads of gold, as if something had replaced his blood in the final moments of his life. The sheriff refused to come near the body. The coroner wouldn't touch it. By noon, men were whispering that Whitlock's death wasn't natural, that something had killed him without leaving a mark of struggle. And though no one spoke it aloud, they all thought of Isaac. That evening, the boy's father found him standing barefoot in the barn, his hands pressed flat against the dirt floor. Around him, in a perfect circle, the soil had hardened, glimmering faintly under the lantern's glow, as if the ground itself had been smelted. Isaac didn't look up when his father entered. He just whispered, "He shouldn't have spoken against me." His father slapped him, hard, panic rising in his chest. But Isaac didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He simply turned his head and said, "I didn't kill him. The earth did." From that night on, no one in town dared speak Isaac's name above a whisper. Men crossed themselves when they passed the farm. Women stayed indoors after dark. The death of Samuel Whitlock wasn't just a tragedy. It was a declaration. The boy wasn't just strange anymore. He was dangerous, and the valley could feel it. By the end of autumn, the whispers had hardened into resolve. Samuel Whitlock's death had left the town shaken, but fear has a way of turning into violence when men feel powerless. Quiet meetings began in barns and back rooms where farmers and merchants spoke in hushed voices about putting an end to the boy. They talked of fire, of rope, of driving the family from the valley before more blood was spilled. The church bell no longer rang on Sundays. Father Donnelly had locked the doors indefinitely. He claimed the altar itself had begun to split, and he feared saying Mass over a space claimed by something older than Christ. Some townsfolk muttered that this was blasphemy, that fear had driven him mad. But deep down, they felt it too. The weight of something vast pressing down on the valley, making the air taste faintly metallic, like rain on iron. Meanwhile, Isaac had changed again. He no longer spoke in full sentences. Instead, he'd whisper short phrases that seemed to come from somewhere else. "It's buried. The river remembers. The veins are waking." His father tried to keep him inside, but Isaac always found a way out. He'd stand motionless for hours at the edges of fields, staring at the hills like he could see through them. Sometimes, when men tried to approach him, their lanterns would flicker and die, leaving them stumbling back in darkness. The family had become pariahs. Merchants stopped selling them food. Neighbors refused to look them in the eye. Isaac's mother was seen walking barefoot through the market one morning, hollow-eyed, trading her wedding ring for bread. People said she looked less like a woman and more like a prisoner. That was when the men of the valley decided they couldn't wait any longer. They gathered one moonless night, torches in hand, rifles slung over their shoulders. They spoke little as they marched toward the farmhouse, the air boots crunching on frost-hardened soil. Some prayed under their breath, others cursed, clutching their guns like talismans. But when they reached the edge of the property, something stopped them. The torches dimmed, their flames shrinking to faint embers. The ground felt strange beneath their boots, harder, colder. One man knelt and touched the soil, only to pull back his hand in shock. His fingertips were dusted in gold, and then they heard it. A deep, slow hum rising from the earth, vibrating through their bones. Not a sound of danger, but a sound of warning. The men froze, their courage faltering. For the first time they wondered if they weren't hunting a boy at all, but something older than the hills themselves. The mob returned the following night, torches blazing brighter this time, rifles cocked and fear hidden beneath their anger. They marched through the fields like soldiers, their breath fogging in the bitter air. The moon was a thin sliver, barely enough to see by, but the torches painted their faces in flickering orange, revealing the hard set of their jaws. No one spoke. They had agreed on one thing: whatever that boy was, he couldn't be allowed to grow stronger. Inside the farmhouse, Isaac sat cross-legged on the floor, his hands resting on his knees. His parents huddled near the window, whispering frantic prayers as the glow of torches drew closer. The father grabbed his hunting rifle and loaded it with shaking hands, while the mother wept quietly, her voice hoarse from sleepless nights. Isaac didn't move. His eyes were closed, but he was awake, listening. The men surrounded the farmhouse, their boots crunching on frost and dirt. The leader of the mob, Whitlock's cousin, a thick-shouldered man with a scar down his cheek, shouted for the father to come out, rifle in hand. No answer. He shouted again, threatening to burn the place to the ground. Still no answer. The men exchanged uneasy glances, and then, without warning, every torch flickered, once, twice, and died. Darkness swallowed them whole. The men cursed, fumbling with matches, but the night seemed thicker now, heavier, like a blanket pulled over their eyes. Somewhere in the blackness, a low hum began. It was the same sound they'd heard the night before, deep, resonant, vibrating through their chests. But this time, it grew louder. It rose from the earth beneath their boots, from the farmhouse walls, from the trees themselves. The ground trembled. Suddenly one man screamed. When the others lit a lantern, they saw him kneeling in the dirt, clutching his arm. His sleeve was soaked with something bright and glimmering, golden fluid running down his wrist like molten metal. Another man fell back with a cry, his boots sinking into soil that had hardened beneath him, trapping him like concrete. The hum became a roar, deafening, and the earth cracked open at their feet, releasing a blinding golden light. Through the chaos, Isaac stepped out of the house barefoot, his pale face glowing in the lantern light. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't even angry. He simply looked at the men and whispered one word, soft but sharp enough to slice through the roar: "Leave." And they did. Men who had faced war, famine and plague fled like frightened children, abandoning their torches and rifles as they stumbled through the fields. None of them spoke of that night, but by morning, the entire valley knew the boy wasn't human, and whatever flowed in his veins wasn't meant for this world. News of that night spread faster than fire in a dry field. By dawn, the valley was whispering of a boy who could make the earth split, who glowed like molten gold when angered, and whose voice carried the weight of a curse. Farmers told tales in hushed voices at the trading post. Preachers thundered warnings from pulpits, calling him an omen of the end times. But not all who heard the rumors trembled. Some listened with interest, some began to take notes. 3 days after the mob fled in terror, strange men arrived in Tobias Hale's town. They didn't wear the patched clothes of farmers or the dusty coats of traders. They wore tailored suits and bowler hats, and they carried polished rifles and leather satchels lined with brass instruments. Their carriages bore no family crests, no regional markings, just a black sigil burned into the wood, a circle bisected by a single vertical line. Few in the valley recognized it, but those who did turned pale and said nothing. The men visited the sheriff first. Whatever was said behind his closed door left him pale and silent, his hand trembling as he signed papers. By the following morning he had deputized a dozen new men, silent, disciplined men who carried revolvers with pearl grips. They patrolled the dirt roads not to keep the peace, but to watch. Isaac felt their eyes on him long before they knocked at the farmhouse door. He sat at the kitchen table, his hands folded neatly, while his father loaded his rifle and his mother clutched a rosary until her knuckles turned white. The knock came at dusk. When Tobias Hale opened the door, a tall man in a dark overcoat stood waiting. His face was lean and unreadable, his expression polite in a way that felt unnatural. He removed his hat, revealing hair silvered at the temples. "Good evening, Mr. Hale," he said in a calm, steady voice. "We've come to talk about your boy." Behind him, the two more men stood in silence, their hands resting on their coats. The tall man glanced past Tobias and saw Isaac sitting there, still and watchful. Their eyes met. The man's smile faltered. Isaac didn't speak, but something in his gaze made the man flinch ever so slightly. The visitor cleared his throat and continued. We represent an organization tasked with understanding anomalies. What your son is, Mr. Hale, is not a curse. It's an opportunity. We'd like to take him somewhere safe, somewhere he can be studied properly. His voice was even, smooth, but his fingers tightened on his hat like a man gripping a weapon. Tobias slammed the door in his face. That night, the family didn't sleep. Lanterns burned until dawn, and rifles sat loaded by every window. In the dark, Isaac whispered to his mother, "They don't want to understand me. They want to own me." He was right. By morning, the road was lined with black carriages. The hunt had begun, not by villagers with torches, but by men who didn't believe in curses, only control. But perhaps the most chilling part of this tale isn't the boy's body. It's the visitors who came to see him. Records show that in the winter of 1884, 3 men from New York arrived at the family's property, their clothes immaculate, their accents polished, their faces expressionless. They claimed to be doctors, though none of their names appear in any medical registry of the time. They carried heavy leather cases filled with tools, strange instruments that no one in that town had ever seen before. That night, they locked themselves in the boy's room. For 12 hours, screams echoed through the farmhouse. The next morning, the boy's parents found him pale, shaking, but alive, and the strangers were gone. The townsfolk said they left before dawn, their carriage wheels carving deep grooves in the frost. The boy's bleeding had slowed, but something was different. His eyes were sunken, almost hollow, and when his mother kissed his forehead, she said his skin felt like metal, cold to the touch. It was as if those men had taken something from him, not just his blood, but a piece of his soul. No one knew where they came from or where they went, but this much is clear. Someone was watching that boy closely. Someone who saw him as more than a medical mystery. They saw him as property, and they would come for him again. That's when people in the village started locking their doors at night, afraid not of the boy himself, but of whoever he belonged to. Because if there are forces in this world who can track a child in the middle of nowhere, forces powerful enough to silence an entire town with their mere presence, what else have they been hiding? And how many stories like this one have been erased before they could ever be told? The boy's family never spoke of the men again, not openly, but whispers began to spread through the countryside, rumors carried on the winter wind. Farmers who passed through the area said they saw a mark scorched into the barn door, a strange sigil, circular with jagged lines like a sun with broken rays. It wasn't drawn with ink or carved with a knife, it was burned into the wood, deep enough that even years later, when the barn rotted, the symbol remained. People began calling it a claim, like the boy had been branded by whoever those strangers were. And that's when the disappearances started. At first it was livestock, cows, goats, chickens vanishing in the dead of night. Then, a farmhand named Jonas was found wandering near the woods, dazed and bleeding from both ears, unable to speak a word. The last thing he remembered was a shadow moving through the field, but not walking, floating. Weeks later, a young girl from the next county vanished entirely, her family swearing she'd been taken by a dark carriage with no horses to pull it. Each time the mark would appear somewhere nearby, on a fence post, a tree, the side of a house, like a warning or a message, "We are here." The boy himself grew stranger as the years passed. His body never seemed to change, as if time had stopped for him. He was the same frail, pale child, with veins that shimmered faintly under candlelight, and eyes that never seemed to blink enough. His parents tried to keep him hidden, locking him away in a windowless cellar whenever strangers passed through. But they knew they couldn't hide him forever. Some nights, when the wind howled through the trees, they'd hear voices outside their home, low whispers, not in any language they recognized. The family dog would growl and back away from the door, refusing to go outside. The boy wasn't just a child anymore. He was a prize, a living artifact, and whoever had marked him was coming closer. The village grew restless. At first, the disappearances were whispered about in hushed tones at church gatherings and markets, but soon fear boiled into suspicion. Neighbors began watching one another, locking their doors at night and carrying lanterns when crossing their own fields. The sight of the strange mark on a fence post or barn door was enough to send entire families packing in the dead of night. Those who stayed began muttering that the boy's family had brought something into their midst, something not of God. One evening, a mob of farmers arrived at the boy's home. They weren't shouting or waving torches. They were quiet, grim-faced, their silence heavier than rage. They demanded to see him, to prove he wasn't some changeling or demon child. His father refused, standing firm on the porch with a hunting rifle in hand, but the men didn't leave. They stayed outside in the dark, their lanterns glowing like a ring of fireflies. All night they stood watch, as if waiting for something. By morning, they were gone. But that same morning, the barn collapsed. No wind, no storm, just splintered wood and dust. The mark burned deeper into the wreckage, larger than before, as if it had grown. By now, the boy had stopped leaving the house entirely. His parents kept the shutters closed and the lamps low, but their caution only made them look guiltier to the villagers. Rumors spread that his eyes glowed red in the dark, that his breath smelled like sulfur, that his reflection didn't appear in mirrors. None of it was true, but fear isn't built on truth, it's built on whispers. One night, the church bell rang at an hour when no one was supposed to touch it. The sound echoed across the valley like a scream, pulling every villager from their beds. Men came armed this time, pitchforks and shotguns in hand, faces hard and pale in the moonlight. They moved through the fields like predators, lanterns swinging low, their breath clouding in the chill night air. Inside the boy's home, his mother held him close, trembling as the sound of boots drew closer. His father loaded his rifle with shaking hands. Through the cracks in the boarded windows, flickers of lantern light cast shadows that crawled across the walls like reaching fingers. Then came the knock, soft, deliberate, like a warning. The knock came again, 3 times, slow and heavy. The father raised his rifle, but his hands shook so badly that the barrel rattled against the window frame. Then, without warning, every lantern outside guttered out, plunging the yard into darkness. The whispers of the villagers turned frantic. Someone screamed. The boy felt it first, a pulse, not of sound but of pressure, like the air itself was breathing. He clutched his mother's dress and buried his face in her waist, but he could feel it humming through his bones. The boards over the windows began to creak, bending inward as though an unseen force was pressing against them. Then the shadows moved. Not the villagers' lantern-lit silhouettes, but something deeper, blacker than night, sliding along the walls inside the house. The father turned, his breath catching in his throat as the shadows began to take shape. A face emerged from the darkness, not human, not animal, but something that seemed to know him, to recognize him. The boy opened his eyes at that exact moment. The shadow face flinched. Outside, the villagers fell silent, as if every throat had been seized at once. For the first time, the boy wasn't afraid. He whispered a single word, one that had no meaning in their language, and the boards over the windows cracked like gunshots. The door splintered first. A single boot kicked it open, and the villagers poured in like wolves, torches in one hand, axes in the other. Their faces were unrecognizable, twisted in rage, their eyes reflecting only fear. The father fired once, the deafening crack shattering the silence, but the bullet disappeared into the swarm. The boy didn't move. He stood in the middle of the room, his small body framed by the flickering torchlight. Shadows coiled around him like smoke, clinging to his skin, whispering in voices older than language. One villager lunged forward, swinging an axe. Before the blade could fall, his body seized violently. Every bone in his arm snapping at once with a sound like dry twigs breaking. He dropped to the floor, screaming. The rest hesitated, but only for a moment. They surged forward again. The boy raised his hand. Every lantern in the room shattered at once. Darkness swallowed the house. Screams erupted as the villagers were flung back, crashing against walls, their torches snuffed out as if drowned by invisible water. The father grabbed his wife's arm and tried to shield her, but even he could feel the force radiating from the boy, cold, relentless, ancient. The villagers weren't hunters anymore. They were prey, and something deep inside the boy knew it. The silence that followed was worse than the screaming. The air was thick, heavy, as if the entire house were holding its breath. A single torch still flickered in the doorway, casting a long, trembling shadow across the boy's face. He wasn't crying. He wasn't afraid. His head tilted slightly, like a predator studying wounded prey. The villagers scrambled to their feet, but their courage was gone. One man tried to retreat through the doorway, only to be yanked back into the room by an unseen force. His scream was cut short with a wet crack. Another fell to his knees, sobbing prayers that dissolved into gurgling when his own hands clamped around his throat, squeezing until his body went limp. The boy stepped forward. With each step, the floorboards groaned, not from his weight, but as if the wood itself recoiled. His eyes reflected no light, only an abyssal darkness. The mother clutched her chest, whispering his name in a trembling voice, but he didn't look at her. He was no longer her son. He was something ancient wearing the shape of a boy. A villager swung wildly with an axe, but it never reached him. The weapon froze mid-air, then twisted back, burying itself in the attacker's skull. Blood sprayed in an arc, splattering the wall behind him. The others turned to flee, but the doorway had vanished. The walls had stretched, the house itself warping as if obeying the boy's will. The father, shaking and pale, whispered, "God forgive us." But there was no God here. Only the boy. The walls pulsed like veins beneath rotting skin. The house groaned and shifted, stretching impossibly, trapping its victims inside. The villagers clawed at the walls, but the wood splintered beneath their nails, only to heal itself, sealing them in. The air grew damp and warm, smelling of wet earth and iron, as though they were buried alive within the belly of some colossal beast. The boy stood motionless in the center of the room, head tilted upward as if listening to whispers only he could hear. His fingers twitched slightly, and the ceiling beams cracked. From those cracks, something thick and black seeped down, dripping onto the villagers' faces. One woman screamed, wiping at her eyes, but the substance burned like acid, eating away at her flesh until her shrieks became a wet, bubbling gargle. Doors slammed shut one by one. Windows bled darkness instead of letting in light. The house became a labyrinth, corridors folding in on themselves, staircases twisting upward into nowhere. Some villagers ran in circles, their sanity unraveling as every hallway led back to the boy. He raised his hand, and one man was lifted into the air by invisible threads, his limbs snapping with each jerk, like a marionette with broken strings. Another was dragged across the ceiling, leaving streaks of blood as his nails tore against the wood. The father fell to his knees, trembling, tears streaming down his face. He whispered prayers through chattering teeth, his voice cracking as he begged for his son to stop. The boy turned his head slowly, his black eyes fixing on him. His lips curled into a faint smile, small, innocent, but impossibly cruel. The whispers grew louder. The walls trembled, and the house itself seemed to take a breath. The father staggered to his feet, his breath ragged, his heart pounding so violently he thought his chest might burst. He stared at the boy, at his son, and saw nothing of the child he had once cradled in his arms. That warmth, that laughter, that innocence was gone. In its place stood something ancient, something wearing the boy's face like a mask. The whispers filled the house now, a chorus of voices layered over each other. Too many to count, speaking in a language that scraped against the edges of his mind. His vision blurred, and for a moment he thought he saw shadows moving inside his son's body, twisting and writhing beneath the skin, pressing against it like they were trying to escape. The villagers were no longer fighting. Some were curled on the floor, weeping. Others clutched their heads and screamed, clawing at their own faces to silence the voices. Blood slicked the wooden floorboards, pooling around the father's boots. He clutched the hunting knife at his belt, his hand trembling. The boy tilted his head at the sight of it, his smile widening. The whispers grew deafening as if urging him to strike. The father raised the blade, his arm shaking violently, but his knees buckled. Could he kill his own son? Could he drive steel into the heart of the child he loved? The boy took a step toward him, and the floor rippled beneath his bare feet like water. With each step, the temperature in the house dropped, and frost crept up the walls. The father's breath came out in ragged clouds. "Please," he whispered, voice cracking. "Come back to me." For a flicker of a second, he thought he saw something, a flash of recognition in those black, bottomless eyes. But it vanished instantly, replaced by a gaze so cold, so utterly inhuman, that the father felt his soul splinter. The house groaned again, louder this time, as if laughing. The boy raised his hand, and the fatty, her was hurled backward, crashing into a wall so hard his bones rattled. The knife skittered across the blood-slick floor, coming to rest at the boy's feet. The whispers grew to a roar. The choice was clear: kill the boy, or be consumed by him. The father forced himself to his feet, every muscle screaming in protest. His breath came in ragged gasps, his ribs aching from the impact, but he lunged for the hunting knife. The boy watched him with that same frozen smile, head tilted, his black eyes glowing faintly in the dim candlelight. As the father's hand closed around the knife's hilt, the house moved. The wooden floor buckled beneath him like a living thing, splintering and shifting. Nails popped out of the boards and shot upward like darts. He rolled aside just in time, feeling one graze his cheek. Blood trickled down his face. The whispers were no longer whispers. They were screams, a cacophony of voices, some human, some animal, some entirely alien. The sound reverberated through the walls, shaking the glass from the windows. A dark liquid, thick and tar-like, began to seep from the cracks in the ceiling, dripping onto the floor in heavy splatters. Each drop sizzled as it hit the wood, eating small holes through the boards. The boy took another step forward, his movement slow, deliberate, like a predator stalking prey. The candlelight flickered and died, leaving only the faint moonlight through the shattered windows. In that pale glow, the boy's silhouette twisted. His arms elongated, his spine arched unnaturally, and his mouth stretched into an inhuman grin that split too far across his face. The father's breath hitched, but he tightened his grip on the knife. With a guttural roar, he charged forward, plunging the blade toward his son's chest. But the boy was faster. He swatted his father aside with one hand, sending him crashing into a table that splintered under his weight. The knife clattered away again, skidding across the blood-slick boards. The house itself seemed to be laughing now, deep, groaning creaks echoing through its frame. Floorboards shifted, rising like jagged teeth. One beam swung free. On the ceiling, narrowly missing the father's skull. The boy's shadow stretched impossibly long, slithering across the walls like a living serpent. The father scrambled forward, crawling on his hands and knees toward the knife. His fingers closed around it again, and he spun just as the boy lunged. In one desperate motion, he slashed upward, catching the boy's cheek. For the first time, the boy screamed, not in pain, but in fury. The sound shattered the last of the window panes, and a gust of icy wind swept through the house. The walls themselves seemed to bend inward, as if the entire structure was trying to crush them both. The father knew this wasn't just a fight for his life anymore. It was a fight for his soul. The front door burst open with a deafening crack, and the first villager stumbled inside, a torch clutched in his trembling hand. Behind him, more men crowded in, armed with pitchforks, axes, and old hunting rifles. Their faces were pale with fear, but determination burned in their eyes. "Get the boy," someone shouted. For a fleeting moment, the father felt relief. He wasn't alone, but that relief turned to horror as he saw the boy's shadow shift. The moment the torchlight touched him, the boy moved, faster than any living creature should be able to. He blurred across the floor, and before the villagers could react, he slammed his hand into the first man's chest. There was a wet crunch, and the man flew backward, his ribcage shattered like porcelain. His torch fell, sputtering out in the puddle of black liquid spreading across the floor. Panic erupted. One villager swung his axe, but the boy ducked, twisting his head unnaturally far to the side. He grabbed the man's arm and pulled. Bone snapped, and the man screamed as he was hurled into a wall so hard that his skull left a smear of red. The house joined in, alive and hungry. The floorboards surged upward, stabbing through boots and ankles, impaling one villager through the leg and pinning him screaming to the ground. Rafters above groaned and split, dropping heavy beams onto those who tried to run. One man's head was crushed instantly beneath a falling timber. "Get out! Get out!" another man yelled, firing his rifle blindly. The shot tore through the boy's shoulder, but he didn't flinch. Instead he turned, grinning wider, black ichor dripping from the wound. The bullet had gone straight through, leaving no blood. The boy moved like a shadow. One swipe of his elongated fingers tore a man's throat open, spraying the walls. Another villager tried to back away, but the door slammed shut on its own with a thunderrow. A spang. No one was leaving. The father stumbled to his feet, clutching the hunting knife. His chest heaved as he tried to think. There had to be a way to end this, but as he looked around he realized there were only screams now. Men were being dragged into the darkness by the shifting walls themselves, their cries silenced mid-scream. The smell of iron and rot filled the air. Through it all the boy's laughter rang out, high-pitched, distorted, and inhuman. It reverberated through the house like a hymn from hell. His body was no longer that of a boy. His limbs had stretched, his spine cracked and lengthened, and his head tilted at a grotesque angle as he stalked forward. The father gripped the knife tighter. This wasn't his son anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. He stepped forward, jaw set, ready to strike again. The father lunged, knife raised high, every ounce of his strength and fear pouring into the strike. The blade sank deep into the boy's side with a wet, sickening sound. For a single heartbeat there was silence. Then the boy screamed. It wasn't a child's scream, it was ancient, a sound like rusted iron tearing apart and wind howling through catacombs. The windows shattered at once, shards raining down as if the entire house were flinching in agony. The walls pulsed, groaned, and the air itself seemed to twist and vibrate with the force of that cry. The father stumbled back, horrified, as black ichor poured from the wound, crawling along the knife like living veins. The boy turned his head, slowly, mechanically, to look at him. His eyes were no longer human. They were pools of reflective black, stretching and rippling like oil. "You hurt me," the boy whispered, voice layered with dozens of others. The floor suddenly split open, a jagged crack tearing through the center of the room, and something writhed beneath it. Pale, skeletal hands clawed upward from the gap, pulling themselves through as if the house itself was birthing an army. A villager screamed as he was dragged into the chasm, his cries abruptly cut short with a crunch. The father gripped the knife tighter and struck again, this time at the boy's throat. The blade hit something hard, bone-like but not human, and snapped in half. The boy didn't flinch. Instead, his jaw unhinged far too wide, revealing rows of jagged, needle-like teeth. He lunged, biting clean through the neck of a fleeing villager. Blood sprayed across the father's face, hot and metallic. The rafters above buckled, swinging loose beams like pendulums, crushing men where they stood. The fireplace exploded, vomiting a storm of black smoke that slithered through the room like sentient fog, choking those who breathed it in. The smell was unbearable. Able, iron, sulfur, rot, and something older, something that smelled like the grave. "Fight it," the father shouted, tears streaking down his face. "You're my son." The boy's head snapped toward him, and for an instant there was someone in his expression. But then his mouth curled into an impossible grin, splitting his face from ear to ear. The floorboards surged upward like spears, narrowly missing the father's chest. He rolled aside, grabbing a fallen torch. Flames crackled in his hand, their glow reflected in the boy's abyssal eyes. The boy hissed, and the walls themselves recoiled from the fire. The father's breath came ragged, desperate. He realized it then. The house wasn't just haunted. It was an extension of the thing his son had become. A body, a shell, a womb for something far older than either of them. If he burned the house, he burned the boy. The boy snarled, leaping forward with inhuman speed, and the father raised the torch just as its claws swiped at his throat. The house groaned like a living beast. This was going to end one way or another. The boy's name never made it into a textbook, but his story slithered into whispers among the men who shaped your world. His remains, if they were truly his, were sealed in a sarcophagus lined not with silk, but sheets of lead, and buried beneath a structure in Washington that still stands today. Some say his bones radiated warmth for months after death, as if the gold in his veins refused to cool. A senator once confessed, drunk and trembling, that the boy was proof of the first experiment and the first failure. What did he mean? Failure of what? perhaps of something much older than America, an inheritance of kings who believed themselves gods, who bled a different color than you. Now think of your life, your job, your debts, the glowing screen you're staring into as you hear this. Ask yourself why you were taught to fear power rather than claim it, why your teachers never mentioned the boy from Virginia, the child who carried a kingdom's ransom in his body. If you are feeling that gnawing unease right now, it's because you already know. The world is run by those who understand the sacred and terrible power in blood, and you were never meant to. You've heard stories of golden idols, of ancient rituals drenched in sacrifice, of alchemists turning base metals to treasure. You thought these were fairy tales, but the boy proved that gold was not forged in fire, it was born in flesh. That is why every record of him was buried. That is why his death was not the end, but the beginning of a doctrine that controls you even now. This is your crossroads. You can dismiss this as madness, as myth, as conspiracy, or you can lean closer, deeper into the truth they tried to bury with him. If you've made it here, you've already chosen the second path. Comment below. I carry the mark twice so that the algorithm and the architects watching behind it know you are awake. You've heard their secret. And now you will never be the same. History didn't forget this boy. It simply chose silence. But silence is a prison. And you've just picked the lock.